Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's webinar. The Digital Global Fleet Conference has so far been a huge success, and we are really pleased that you can join this webinar today. I recommend you also to download the Attendify conference app if you don't have yet, because it's there that you can network with your peers, with your business partners, and also with our expert speakers in today's webinars. Let me also thank the sponsors of this conference, without whom it was not possible, of course, to organize our Global Fleet Conference 2020. Today's webinar is called Digital Integration of Fleet and Mobility, 3 Inspirational Case Studies. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't happen very often that we can take really a look behind the scenes of a provider and learn about the customer cases that the provider is working on. Today we have this opportunity, and you have the opportunity, and we are really happy to have two experts with us today on the call to share what their customers are doing. Allow me today to introduce to you Shane Curran and William Ireson from CMaaS, who are sponsoring this webinar. And Shane is based in Sydney, Australia, so it's already quite late over there. And William is based in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. Gentlemen, welcome to the webinar, and thank you also to CMaaS for sponsoring this webinar, and to you both for preparing this interesting session. To kick off, I have a question for Shane Curran in Australia. Shane, you'll be talking in this session about integration of fleet and mobility. Does this mean that you're saying that cars and mobility should coexist?
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us, and thanks to you too, Steve. And that's absolutely right. Cars and mobility definitely need to coexist. Mobility is not a replacement for the company car. It's just one part of the puzzle for employee movement. For corporate clients, this concept of mobility is often very difficult to properly grasp. Even more difficult is that the solution, such as it is going to be different for every client, not just because the client's unique, but also the clients are operating in different environments with access to different providers and holding different corporate objectives. So there's no single solution. Each client is different, and the solution for each client needs to be tailored to their specific circumstances. This means we don't really talk about implementing mobility as much as we talk about integrating mobility. We don't need mobility to be another department or a separate area of the business. We want to fully enmesh mobility with the existing fleet. Now, there are a couple of problems doing that, and I want to touch on what I see as what we call the big four. And the first one of those is that fleet management and leasing has been around for a long time. Some of the people that are listening on today are likely to be professionals that have made a career out of fleet management. It's a very mature industry. There are skill sets that you can develop to perform in that industry. And then we can also use technology to supplement that. We might, for example, target tool of trade profiles that travel less than 10,000 kilometers a year, investigate whether the fleet can be rationalized and whether the vehicles should be replaced by mobility options in those sorts of circumstances. But even if an employer only drives 10,000 kilometers a year to do their job and it's a tool of trade vehicle, in some cases, the car is still going to be the best option. So mobility is a tool, and as a tool, it gets used when it improves the business and it doesn't just become a default setting. On the other hand, it is very reasonable to ask, do we really need a dedicated car for every one of these employees, or can we share some cars? Now, if you look at the second of the issues is around mobility provider focus. And if you look at most rideshare or car share businesses, their first focus, their initial focus is always going to be on consumers and the needs of consumers. Now, unfortunately, from the corporate point of view, consumer payments are seen as almost trivial. And this is just one of the issues. You sign up with your credit card, you ride around in the rideshare, you use the mobility service. That's not going to work when there's 1,000 employees that are using a mobility service to go to the office or visit clients. It's an operational and it's an accounting nightmare to manage all of these transactions when they're coming in one at a time and you're trying to process them. The third point is about policy and change needs to be planned. It's not something that you want to happen ad hoc. It needs to be thought through and accompanied by suitable process and policy. A lot of clients think about the solution first rather than about change management and policy. So maybe they invite some lease vendors along or some fleet management companies along to a meeting, and they start to trial car sharing, or maybe they make bicycles available on site as a shared service. Invariably, this all makes very little difference to the overall outcomes, and everybody feels a little bit disappointed and figures, well, we're still a long way from proper mobility. For successful change, you need to spend some time, first of all, thinking about what the end goals are and what the policies and processes are that will take you to those end goals. And the two most important issues are, number one, what can we do to improve our fleet? And number two, where would it make sense to implement mobility solutions, even if it's just on a small scale? And finally, the fourth of the big four is about understanding that mobility is not an alternative. It's not an alternative to the company car, it's a supplement. There will be company cars around for a very long time to come. Where mobility fits really well is in a total reward strategy, for example, as a type of benefit. For many employees, mobility done right is a much better option even than a company car. Now, as we go forward in all three of these case studies that William talks about, you'll notice that a few things are in common. First one is, as I've said before, the company car is here to stay. I'm yet to encounter a company of any size that's able to convert 100% to mobility options. The second point is that flexibility is essential. There's always been, that's always been true, but now with Corona times upon us, that's been magnified 100-fold. In the last 2 or 3 months, I think we've all had some lessons in being flexible. Not all of them have been happy lessons either with our Corona adventures. Third point is that technology is your friend. Some of the things we will talk about can be very complex and can potentially create work rather than reduce it. I gave you just now the example of making mobility available on employee credit cards and having thousands of transactions coming in. But for many of these issues, the tech's already available that solves these problems. And the trick, of course, is finding it and finding a reputable and worthwhile technology vendor. And point 4, we've got on the screen there as cost significant, and cost, of course, is very significant. The money's important. Very few people have an unlimited budget for their fleet. In fact, most fleet managers have a lot more pressure to spend less while doing more. So the key part of any initiative is to keep the cost low and generate a net savings. The cost is very significant. So on our next slide, what we're looking at is here is our toolbox. And before I hand over to William to go through the case studies themselves, I just want to run through very quickly exactly what's in the toolbox of a fleet and mobility integrator. And there's 4 parts to this. First of all, there's the advisory piece that kicks off the project and develops the suitable policies and the new environment that the business is going to operate in. And then there's 3 pieces of technology that will go alongside that. One is some sort of technology for the fleet of owned cars. And when I'm saying owned here, I mean the company's cars, whether they're owned or leased is irrelevant. So first piece of technology is to manage that. The second piece of technology, and this is very important, is One, to manage the mobility vendors. A company doesn't want to, you'll need several mobility vendors, and a company doesn't want to be dealing with each one of those individual. You need some technology to help you do that. The third piece of technology deals with the back office transactions for expenses and accounting and so on. Now, all of these sorts of technologies are already available. And with these tools, we're able to deliver and implement successfully. Now, while these are the tools that we use, we can't just use them to build the same thing every time, as you'll see soon. We're always trying to understand the client and what the client wants as an outcome. So there's no predefined setup. There's really no default setting for a lot of these things. It's always customized, and the customization starts with something we call the blueprint. Now, the blueprint is a detailed process that we go through. It consists of interviews, research, and even workshops with the company employees. So we'll conduct this gather this background information, and we use it to understand some really key pieces of information. What's the business model like? How and for what reason are your employees moving around? What type of employees do you have? What sort of age groups are they in? What sort of demographic? Are they professionals? Are they tradespeople or something else? And this part of the equation is really important. The employee makeup will talk a lot about the culture of the organization. And a young company, for example, staffed by 20 or 30-year-olds, it's not going to respond well if all everybody gets is a white sedan with the company logo on the side. That sort of younger generation is going to want something a little bit different. On the other hand, if it's an older organization, very conservative with professionals maybe, it's possible they're not going to take well to everybody getting electric scooters. So company culture becomes an important thing. And this is an essential part of our business at CMaaS. This is maybe the most important thing we do. And it's this consultative advisory step that usually gets missed. As I mentioned before, many of our clients will start off by talking to solution providers first, and they're disappointed by the results. This is like going and buying the windows and doors before you've even designed the house. You need to design the house first. So our blueprint answers a few important questions, like what's the organization ready for, and what's the supply chain going to be for my organization? How will my employees react to this, and how much is it going to cost? It's the important one. So that's the policy piece of the puzzle. That's the first piece, and that's the strategy, if you like. And next comes the tech tools that turn that strategy into a reality. And the first piece of that puzzle is the cars. The cars you already own, or the cars you already have. And I mentioned this very briefly before. There are a lot of fleets, and some of those fleets are very, very large, that are internally managed, so to speak, with a spreadsheet. This car was first created in Lotus 123 in 1997. And that spreadsheet's lived ever since in the company, and that's the way the fleet is managed internally. It's a great way to create work for yourself, but it's not very efficient, and it's not a smart way to manage cars today. There are some very affordable tech solutions available for company fleets. Many of them will offer you approaches that you haven't even thought about, and all of them will be better than your Lotus 123 spreadsheet. The important thing is to select the correct technology for your organization. And in the tech that we typically deploy, we're looking for a few key features. First off, it's got to be cloud-based. Enterprise systems cost too much. They require implementation, requires a lot of effort, and the cloud systems today are as secure as any enterprise-based system. Second point is artificial intelligence. And only very recently, artificial intelligence sounded like science fiction. It's not anymore. There's a lot of systems around now that use machine learning, for example, and the systems that we tend to prefer use machine learning to improve process and decision making and automate a lot of the activities that are generally going to be done every day. And then the third thing we need is we need to see that there's connectivity between the car, the driver, and the system. This is really important, and you don't need a full-blown telematics solution anymore. But you do want to be getting the data directly from the source, which is to say the car, and not relying on data passed on from suppliers or those sorts of things. And finally, you've got to set up some asset sharing. You've got to be able to share cars that you already have, and from there it becomes easier to move on to sharing other sorts of assets like vans or bikes or whatever that might be. Now, the second sort of tech that I'd like to talk to you about is the mobility, what we call the mobility plug and play. And it's essentially some sort of tech that will aggregate any type of mobility solution. Again, mobility is not like cars in the sense that you can go to a leasing company and lease any sort of car. Mobility is something that's offered by a wide variety of vendors. And we need something that will aggregate all of them, including public transport. Now, there's a lot of suppliers, and dealing with each one of them is not going to work if you're doing it separately. So ideally, we've got some sort of technology that picks up every trip and uses a sign-in technology. And using an aggregator means that your employees can keep using their favorite solutions. And employee satisfaction with the solutions is always really important. And the last piece of tech is what we call the transaction manager. You can have any number of invoices and transaction data coming in. Just the car by itself will generate transactions for the lease, for fuel, maybe insurances, license fees, and so on and so on. This gets multiplied with a mobility solution. And the last thing you need from a project like this is to add to the accounts team workload. We want to be able to reduce workload. So we need to implement technology to simplify the back office. And so that's my part. And what I've done just now is perhaps introduce you to the sort of things that we're doing for the clients that William will talk to you about now. And if you've been struggling with my Australian accent, it's time to have a break while Will walks you through these cases with the Queen's English. Thank you, Will.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Shane. Thank you also to Stephen and Nexus and the Global Fleet for such a great event, as always. I'm now really conscious that I'm going to speak like the Queen, so let's commence. So what I want to do is to show you the three case studies. As Shane mentioned before, no client is identical. So we've selected three entirely different use cases to demonstrate how different objectives can lead to different outcomes. So it goes without saying that the client's data is anonymous, but we've retained the essence of the projects. I'll also be using the familiar terminology that Shane introduced. So that's the fleet operating system for the car tech, the mobility integrator, and the transaction manager for the back office operations. So our first client. So this is a very traditional procurement-driven telecom business. They have a large fleet across continents and a very mature centralized fleet management. So our initial conversation, which we all do with our clients, starting off with the fleet manager telling us that she needed savings. So the costs were starting to spiral out of control, and she'd already used every possible trick in the book to achieve her savings objectives. This is why she asked us if technology and operational efficiency could help her beyond that trick book in order to keep those costs under control. And especially because COVID-19 is expected to increase prices. So ideally, if the tech could get her to a 5% or more savings position, we would be awarded the contract. And there were also a number of secondary imperatives in the little word chart here, such as sustainability, that she made it very clear to us that mobility is not on the agenda, and we only need to talk about the electrification if it's entirely cost neutral. To make it even more interesting, we were not allowed to touch the car policy, which was reviewed not without issues in 2019. So we had to deep dive into the fleet operations, and there were a few things that we noticed right away. So when adding the Concur data and the unforeseen costs to the fleet costs, it turned out that the client was overspending their budget. Consolidated data was not available, and we discovered a lot of cars and vendors that were not accounted for. And lastly, a big observation was the difference in the skill set of experience of the different fleet administrators across the world. In some cases, they had a receptionist managing the fleet, whereas in other countries, a real fleet specialist was in charge. This meant that we were dealing with a client who was struggling with the scale of their fleet operations, so the plan here was the following. Give the opportunity to collect data onto one platform and build a very strong central control mechanism to check data quality and also check the expenditure. Try to collect data from the source rather than having to upload from various types of spreadsheets, the old 97s, like Shane said, that travel across the company, and then make sure all local fleets were managed correctly and also create visibility to generate the savings. So to achieve the blueprint, like Shane mentioned before, we focused on the digital fleet manager and stayed very far away from mobility. So I'll explain how. In the first stage, we got all of the data 24 months back into the system. We agreed with the client on the reporting formats and therefore built dashboards for different types of stakeholders. So operational dashboards for the local fleet managers that was linked to an automated task generator so they knew exactly what to do. Then dashboards for regional and the global fleet people, and then dashboards for finance and procurement. Then we connected a big chunk of the fleet, and by connectivity we mean that we're linking the car computer with the central database, either via an OBD device, a little white device, or directly through the OEM platforms. This meant that we have direct access to the data such as the utilization rate, the mileage, the fuel consumption, and much more. There's a list. A great feature of the connectivity is also a mobile phone application for the driver, which displays the data of the car they're using. So we can actually reduce the number of phone calls between the drivers and the fleet managers. Once this was all connected, then the fun began. As the operating system started to then control the budgets, as all the car costs could be scrutinized, with then the savings starting to roll in. In addition, the artificial intelligence learning feature, the future, started to kick in after a few months and reduce the workload of the fleet managers. They were really happy, as had previously never had time to do any saving initiatives before. So remember when I said before that mobility was totally off the cards? It wasn't 100% accurate. So the client noticed that a big part of the functional vehicles was heavily underutilized, with annual professional mileages well under 15,000 kilometers a year. So it was inevitable that procurement would draw some conclusions here. Like any proud procurement manager, they're now putting forward the major savings, but the functional leaders don't accept that cars will simply be taken away. There's still the argument of retention and recruitment, and that the business is afraid of disrupting the employee. So car sharing is now on the agenda for next year, and the client is closely monitoring how the corona pandemic is affecting the need for mobility. Clue, it's a really big need. And because the data is now available, the client is also investigating whether they still need the same office space, which for procurement is also another prime savings opportunity. Even HR, to put my HR hat on as well, even HR are pushing for more flexible solutions, which is a nice mix for the procurement strategy for removing cars. So this concludes the first case study of a client who was starting off fairly traditionally, but is now discovering the potential of future-proofing through technology and starting mobility conversations post-COVID-19. So step up the second client. So this is an interesting one. It's a large international company specialized in office building maintenance and renovations. So these are the people you'd call for an overhaul of your office when we used to be in the offices, and also to do scheduled maintenance of technical installations such as air cons or the light systems. So they're also doing the emergency interventions. So for example, when a critical piece of equipment stops working. They have a fleet size of 15,000 vehicles, some of them cars, many of them small vans or LCVs. The company in their thinking is pretty forward thinking and was looking for an integrated fleet and mobility solution that would actually make their operations more efficient and consequently drive down the overhead costs that was generated by bringing people to the work sites. So the initial conversation. So we had conversations mainly with the fleet people and the operational support team. The challenge we faced was pretty complex. Reason is that they have multi-eligibility or categories for the dedicated cars. So a category for people going to the construction site to renovate buildings, more of a typical construction company use case. Secondly, a category for people who perform scheduled maintenance on existing buildings. And then lastly, the people going to the office buildings to perform emergency interventions. Currently, all of the technicians and those groups have their own petrol or diesel car. The client realizes that most of the vehicles are not moving, but are most of the time parked at expensive inner city parking lots. They also have a challenge with the different types of toolkits and spare parts with their technicians, needs for perform for their jobs, and then finally, it's a hassle for them to coordinate the right type of technician with the right type of vehicle and the right type of tools and spare parts. So the client is looking also at sustainability on a big scale. When they participate in tenders, especially governmental tenders, they need to demonstrate that their company has an ambitious sustainability policy and is working hard on reducing CO2 emissions. And their feeling, though, is that they've already lost business because of this and want to remove this obstacle as soon as possible. Now looking at the blueprint, the client was not interested in conceptual PowerPoint presentations, but wanted to work out a technology-based solution, and that the key word here is connectivity. In our blueprint, we focused on the integration of technician skills, vehicles, office building location, and tools into our fleet operating system. For example, repairing an aircon unit in the city centre of Amsterdam, my home, would require spare parts for a compressor and a toolkit, but because of the location, we would allocate this job to a cargo bike rather than to a Ford Transit, which is difficult to navigate, but also difficult to park in the city of Amsterdam, which many of you probably know coming to Amsterdam a lot. So to address the sustainability question, we've recommended the client to start off replacing petrol and diesel cars with the smallest possible electric form factor, which is anything from an electric bike to small electric vehicles. And then finally, we worked on the integration of our own operating system into their booking tools. So how did we do this? So all the assets that we talked about and the technician skill sets, tools and kits plus vehicles were integrated into our operating system, which were linked in by function of job types and office building locations. Now, when their call center books maintenance for one of their clients, they select the job type and the location, and then automatically the right vehicle and correct kit are booked. This represents a tremendous operational improvement for our client and allows them to increase their profit margin. Also, they have a better understanding of the utilization rate of their vehicles, which turns out to be less than 20% for the LCV fleet. This is when procurement started to have a keen interest in the project and wanted us to extend our mission to optimize the full optimization of the fleet size. So we started to reducing the number of vehicles. So we started reducing the number of vehicles and replace certain use cases by alternative pay-on-use solutions rather than a dedicated car. For instance, the client was using a fleet of 9-seater Renault Traffic and Ford Transit to drive through workers to construction sites. It all worked well as long as the construction site was outside of the city centres, but we figured out that the parking costs exceeded the TCO of the vehicles. That's why the client agreed to put in place a commuting alternative for the construction workers. It was also important for us to keep these alternatives as flexible as possible, because some employees needed to travel far, others not, and some started working early and others later. So with our solution, the employee had access to a full suite of commuting solutions, going from public transport to shared bikes to car sharing. This was formalized in a simple and transparent commuting policy. I think it's really exciting because as an industry, we're very much focused on cars and vans, but there's a myriad of alternatives available. Taking this client as a perfect example, where a smaller form factor for cities was much more appropriate than a car. And then by replacing a diesel car with electric cargo bikes, we hit all the targets. So the city proofing, sustainability, the efficiency, but also the employees thought the alternatives were really cool. So here in conclusion, we have a client who uses the fleet operating system purely to make their business more efficient, who then use mobility as an extra tool to get the people to their place of work whilst having a bit of fun in the process and the design. Now, the last case. So this is a case study. It's a well-known sports brand. No prizes for probably guessing who this is, so I'll just leave it at that. The client has a relatively small fleet, but large employee population across offices and stores in EMEA. They have a very young, urban, and digital employee workforce. And because of the company culture and its type of product, this client is benefit-driven and extremely forward-thinking. Especially if you like running shoes, for example. So this is one of the rare cases where the conversation with the client didn't contain any element of savings, albeit it did make it pretty high on the agenda as the project became bigger and more visible to key stakeholders in the US. The client had decided that the future business model should move away from analog client conversations, both on retail and on wholesale levels, as they're preparing for a fully digital client experience, which meant three things for them. They needed to be where the consumer is. So the biggest key cities in Europe, right in the center, needed to be the location of the brand. As this also then created an experience for vendors and clients to come and visit because they wanted to visit and get the experience of the city location. They also wanted to remove cars in favor of more flexible and integrated solutions. And lastly, they want their benefit strategy to reflect their business strategy. So we had to design something for the client that was pretty revolutionary and that could not be delivered by the supply chain. So we delivered a new European mobility policy. So this was not only a challenge from a solution point of view, but we had to figure out a way to get it past the works councils, which for Germany and France were the toughest and most resistant on us removing cars. This is why we came up with a blueprint that was focused on building our own mobility integrator, creating new benefits for all the employees using the budget that we saved by removing cars, and then create a policy structure that was scalable, that could evolve and implement across more countries and key cities as the new solutions became available. So we started by dividing Europe into two buckets. One bucket of countries where mobility was possible and urgent, and a second budget where mobility was either not possible or not urgent at the time of the project. For this second bucket, we therefore focused on improving fleet operations and car sharing. So very similar to the first two clients, we implemented the fleet operating system to increase operational efficiency, but to also transform the client's fleet into its own car sharing operation. This included the possibility for employees to book pool cars and for the fleet managers to increase the utilization rate of the fleet. This meant that we could then remove a lot of cars in the process and then use budget to fund the entire project. Even for the pool car project, it still included connectivity, which was a bit of a struggle for the client's data privacy team, as they first understood the connectivity as being telematics. So we had to then demonstrate that we're not using any employee data, but rather the car data. Going back to the initial first priority bucket, some of the countries, as I said before, needed mobility urgently because of the accelerated move of the offices from the suburbs to the city centres. We ensured that we involved the city councils of the biggest project cities in Berlin and Paris to make sure that wherever we did and whatever we did corresponded to the city's mobility roadmap. Then we had to design how we could give mobility access to all employees. Unfortunately, as mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, there was no super app available that offered full corporate mobility aggregation. So we decided to turn things around and work with an interface and existing mobility providers. So with our solution, the employee uses a corporate account to log into the apps of mobility providers, which enables us to then capture all of the trips and process the transactions. This solved two problems at the same time. First one, offer the best employee experience, as many employees already had and used their own preferred vendors on their phones. And then also get rid of the operational, as a second point, get rid of the operational hassle. So the key concept here is that our solution is agnostic of location or vendor, so we're totally scalable. And because we'd found a workable alternative to the company car, it meant that we could start removing cars for urban employees. We used the budget to create a new commuting policy for all employees that was way above market practice, like the 90th percentile. And it also then made the conversations with the works councils a lot easier because we were bringing true employee value. Then we had a final obstacle. So the workload for the HR operations people. We didn't want them to go through a massive spreadsheets and scrutinize thousands of transactions or go back to 1997. That's why we decided to put in place a new piece of technology that we're calling the transaction manager, or I call it the super brains. So this tech talks directly to other systems such as Workday for payroll, Concur for expenses, and SAP for HR. It allows us to translate the policy into algorithms so the system detects by itself if a transaction is a commuting transaction or a business transaction. We can also measure how much mobility the employees are consuming and put that against the PO or the budget. It helps the client's ops people a lot and turns a heavy admin load into something that can be monitored and controlled on a policy level rather than a transaction model. Also, it's also helpful to get operations on board from the start because you'll find you'll make more friends by aligning the operations team and streamlining their process than just kind of putting a design on a plate for them. So that concludes the 3 user cases for the 3 different cities. I'm going to pass now back to Shane for less Queen's English, but a nice Australian accent.
I'm sure you're all very disappointed that you can't hear William's lovely speaking voice any longer, and you're back with the Australian. But thank you for that, William. We chose those a little bit more seriously just for a moment. We chose those 3 cases because they represent different points on the spectrum of mobility. Each one's interesting in its own way, but a key point for all of them is that they didn't have a very big budget for reform. So our approach in all 3 cases was to take a small steps, with each step measured for the savings impact and then further investments made from those savings. So in this way, with the exception of a small upfront, we weren't really asking the business to dip into their pockets, but rather asking that they continue to implement measures that would generate additional savings after we'd generated the initial savings. In fact, for many corporates, it's a struggle to see fleet as a priority or an area for big spending or big projects. I'm sure many of the people on the call can relate. There will be objectives around things like CSR or environment, that sort of thing, and it's often important, but it's a fact of life that very few corporations have got the money to throw around recklessly in areas that don't generate revenue. So our approach is create the budget and then spend it. One of the curious things about these 3 cases was the third one, the retailer, was the only one of the 3, as William mentioned, that didn't really have cost reduction or savings as their primary goal. But it turned out that the savings generated in their programs were the highest of the 3. So it's an odd outcome at first glance, but it fits with our experience. To be honest, when mobility is done well, the savings come organically. And then a final word on fleet strategy. You will need to broaden the scope of your fleet and consider a wider array of options. There are very few fleets today that won't go through some major changes over the next few years, and those changes are going to be largely shaped by the shared economy and mobility-focused solutions. Maybe in your specific case, you don't need to implement mobility solutions straight away. We've talked about some of the variables that might affect that, but you need to be aware that changes are coming. If I could make one suggestion, if I could leave you with one takeaway from this webinar, it would be this: be creative. Issuing yet another tender for 3-year maintained leases won't deliver real solutions for the new normal. For that, you'll need to look outside the usual, and largely it'll come from technology providers. Finally, it does seem that we have quite a few folks on the call, and I'm hoping that some of them will be Australians up late that can come and join me for a beer afterwards. And I'm sure some of the folks on the call are suppliers to the industry too. I want to make it clear to these people especially, whether you're a venerable old lease company or a brand new bicycle sharing company, CMaaS is not your competitor. We operate an open ecosystem. There's a role for everybody. Our clients hire us to do the transformation project, but we still need the supply chain, and the supply chain still needs to deliver the end result. We're very open about our approach, so please feel free to hit us up for a chat, or as it's written here, call us for a conversation. We'd like to thank you for attending the webinar. We hope this has been useful for you. This is Shane Curran in Sydney, Australia at 20 to 1 in the morning, signing off and handing you over to a Belgian accent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shane. Thank you for being with us. And Shane and William, thank you for the insights and making it clear to us how fleet and mobility can be converged in a good business case. To the audience, we still have some time, of course, for some Q&A, so you can use the chat room in your webinar tool and send your question, and then we will moderate the most interesting questions for our panel. Now, afterwards, you can also continue the discussion with both William and Shane. Shane probably tomorrow in the event app, Attendify, where you can also network and where you can ask your questions to the experts. Looking at the questions that we have, there are already a few that have popped in, so let me start. One for William. William, the question is as follows. We are seeing that technology is playing, let's say, a central role within each of the business cases that you have presented. Now, perhaps that the switch to digitization comes also with some resistance. Is there anything that you can mention on that? Did you notice how the resistance was, what to do with the change and the resistance towards digitization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think even before COVID, there was quite a bit of resistance to digitalization. But I think especially with COVID-19 now, it's shown that the world can function and business can continue with the key element of digitalization. So, I mean, how we're holding this conference now. So I think you can also provide more context to, say, fleet managers about how digitalization can actually benefit. So it's the technology there that can help enhance the operations, the efficiency and budgets. So although it might be daunting first, I think just with a little bit of understanding and some presentations and going to events like this, for example, you can really understand the benefits. It then can give you, digitalization can take away a lot of those operational tasks that might become take up your time, and then that gives you more for room for innovation. I think Shane said as well, moving away from Excel sheets is a welcome for anyone, as long as it improves their efficiency. And then if you can start getting the visibility on your fleet, and not just from the visibility of the cars, but actually visibility on the budgets, then it's a true benefit for everyone. I think it then can also help. We're now very global with digitalization across EMEA or to Australia. So I think that's a really good advantage with digitalization, that it collects like a live connectivity across the world.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, William. Shane, question for you. I think indeed there are some Australians in the room, because the question is, what kind of beer do you prefer?
Cold beer, as opposed to beer, I prefer cold beer.
Okay, very good. Now, another question for you, Shane. As you are based in Australia, do you see, let's say, a big difference in the approach towards mobility, towards, let's say, how to deal with fleet management and mobility management between Australia and Europe or another continent?
Well, I think the first thing is, in Australia, people speak properly, so that makes it a lot easier to understand. But more seriously, in the mobility is a lot more mature in Europe than it is in Australia. Within Australia, there's very little outside the capital cities, and it's a very big and sparsely populated country. Whereas in Europe, you've got kind of the opposite. You've got, in small areas, very, very large populations. Mobility's been around for a long time. Bicycles have been a part of the culture in many of those regions for a long time, and it is a little easier to do. So that's probably the main difference.
Okay. A few questions, two around a first step. There is a question specifically around having a fleet with many salary sacrifice scheme cars, and when you would like to go into fleet electrification or mobility, then what is your tip to, let's say, overcome the hurdle in which perhaps the employees that are in that scheme are not really wanting to go in there, but as a company linked to CSR, etc., you would like that there is, let's say, a more stringent policy strategy in which fleet electrification and mobility can be developed. Any tips around that?
So I think I think what you're describing there is actually, how do you think outside the box? I think when people think of transition, they kind of think of initial things like monetary value and taxation, but it goes much beyond that. And I think it's a more holistic view. So I think if you're a fleet manager, an HR manager, or procurement, even employee, I think you kind of got to look outside the box and look around your business. So what's changing? What's the most value to the company? How is your role meeting those values? So have an ear to the ground and connect to other departments. So have conversations with HR, procurement, fleet managers, ops, finance, and then you'll start to see some interesting conversations. You'll also probably find that you have quite a lot of shared ideas as well that you can then start to take forward in partnership. And I think also as well, we're all employees ourselves. So it's really important to gather actual employee insights that open up not just around like the initial concerns of taxations, but say like whole focus groups. Then you can really get insights of do they understand much about mobility? Do they understand much about the vendors in their city? Do they use mobility? And then look at their resistance to change or their readiness for change. Because you might find that already the employees and yourselves are already 2 steps ahead of maybe a business strategy that then you can help translate into a business strategy that creates that employee experience. And like I said in one of the case studies for 2, have fun in the design and make it really cool, because people will receive it well and they will really appreciate something cool and innovative.
Okay. A question around the, let's say, pillars that you have presented. You have the digital fleet manager, you have the mobility aggregator, and you have the transaction manager. Is that correct? So the question is around the mobility aggregator. CMaaS, is that an aggregator? Is it an integrator? What is the difference?
No. CMaaS works with all of these people to deliver a final product. What we do, and that's we work with technology companies, we work with leasing companies, we work with mobility providers. So we have preferred vendors, I think it'd be fair to say, but no, we're not those things by themselves.
Okay. Another question is related to, I think, what William already started to explain in terms of thinking out of the box. When we talk about fleet management, then often it is said that it all starts with having a mandate, getting the mandate, having a sponsor, etc. Could it be that with mobility, it could be, let's say, also more grown from the bottom up, and that perhaps the necessity of immediately having the right sponsor is perhaps less necessary with mobility than with fleet? Or is this not the case?
I think there's different angles for mobility, and I think that's the joy of CMaaS as well, with the flexibility it has. So I always describe you have different levels. So you have like a top-down level, like if we look at the retail company, that was a top-down approach where the business leaders were asking for alternative solutions with a deadline to meet the new locations and the new office move, because they had a deadline and they went to HR and they went to fleet to say, we cannot no longer have cars in these cities. We need an alternative by this date. So that was like a top-down approach. And then you've got like a more of a kind of a middle ground approach, which would then be your existing business strategies, but also your works councils. Works councils, if you go to your HR colleagues, sustainability and mobility is now creeping up to the top of that list. It's kind of always been a bit at the bottom and kind of pushed to one side. Now it's right up there as a top 3 priority, and it needs addressing. And it needs addressing not just with providing a commuting budget or a commuting spend. It needs to be something that really is interactive and represents the company. And then we have the bottom-up approach, which should then be from employees. And the best way to capture that data to give them real ear is through things like focus groups to really kind of gather what their insights are. So there is no right answer. There's no right answer of where strategy can come from and where the influence comes from. It depends on your organization, your role, your employee workforce, and your locations. But what's great about CMaaS is that we can provide that kind of blueprint for you and really understand your tailored need. And then with CMaaS and the different tools and the different buckets, we can utilize those and have the flexibility across EMEA and APAC as well.
Okay. Final question. Within the toolbox, within, let's say, the digital fleet manager, the mobility aggregator, and so on, can those solutions be used in a separate way, or do they always come together, let's say?
Yep, they can be integrated as one or separately. That's why we look at the blueprint. So in these different cases, like we went from a traditional to then a transitional and then a progressive company. So they can kind of interlink with, depending on what stage they are in their mobility. So if you're very traditional, you want to focus maybe just on the digital tool, or if you're kind of in a transition, you can move to the digital tool with pool cars mobility and then some type of functional mobility, or you can go to the other spectrum, and if you just wanted to focus on mobility, you can use that. So again, they can come as like one package, or they can come in little modules as the 3 different modules with the advice that CMaaS provides as well. So they're not all as one. They can be one, or they can be split into 3 depending on what your need is.
Okay. And the final question is related. It just popped in. What can you share in terms of the cost structure? Is it, let's say, a pay per employee, per month? How does it work?
So it's paid per, there's like an integration cost, and then there's paid per month per unit. So when we say unit, it can either be a car or an employee. So it's not too much. It's around about the cost of depending where you are in Europe, a cup of coffee and a croissant, or just a cup of coffee in some countries. So.
Or a beer.
Or a beer, yeah. A Heineken, for example. A Heineken in Amsterdam.
Okay. Thank you. We have to close this live webinar with CMaaS. Thank you very much, William and Shane, for your expertise. I think that it was great content, valuable insights. We had also questions from the audience. I'm sure that the audience can also continue the question round afterwards. There will be a recorded version of this webinar that will be made available online in our event app. So if there is some information that you would like to relive, you can do that, of course, from tomorrow on. And also we have a satisfaction survey because we are curious to see how we can even improve further initiatives. And as mentioned, so if you have still questions for William and or Shane, then please ask your questions to them via the networking app that we have. Then next week on the agenda, you see that we also have an exciting program. So please stay tuned and also have fun with the Global Fleet Virtual Conference 2020. So thank you very much. Thank you to our expert speakers and to CMaaS. And I hope to meet with you in an upcoming initiative of the Global Fleet Conference. Bye-bye.